Hello, I'm Reverend Ted Wilkinson, pastor here at Bethany United Church of Christ. Thank you for joining me for this Good Friday message. The story of Good Friday that is usually read when there's a church service for it is a few pages long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. But it is a story of sorrow, of pain, and seeming defeat for Jesus and his ministry. And it begins with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane after his Last Supper with his disciples, his betrayal by Judas, his trial before the high priests, and eventually ends with his death on the cross and his body being put into the tomb right before sundown on Friday. So I'm not going to read the whole thing as I mentioned, but I will read you just one passage from the Gospel of Luke. This is going to be verses 44 through 49, and it is the story of Jesus' death on the cross. So he has already been put up onto the cross in between two criminals, and that is where the story picks up. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last breath. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." Then when all the crowds who had gathered there to see this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home beating their chests. But the followers who were with him, the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. The word of the Lord. So as I mentioned, Good Friday is a story of sorrow, of pain, and seeming defeat. And while we know what will happen in just 2 days on Easter Sunday, those who lived in this moment, those who experienced this story, except for Jesus, did not know. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so for them, when we read this story, we need to remember that in that context, and remember it as this is an experience for people of a horrible, horrible day. Things had gone so bad, in fact, since they had entered Jerusalem on, we celebrated out Palm Sunday, but it had probably been Tuesday or Wednesday when they entered Jerusalem with palms. Things had been so hopeful then, but things had gone so bad since then that Jesus' closest disciples had abandoned him, fleeing to a nearby town outside of Jerusalem. Luke mentions here that only a few faithful has stayed with him, women who had followed him from Galilee. And Luke doesn't tell us till after the resurrection who these women were. They were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. And they had been with Jesus through his trials. They had witnessed these things. They had witnessed him being put on the cross and dying, and then they had helped put him into the tomb. It is probably from their testimony that the gospel writers have any account of what happened or transpired with Jesus at all. Because as mentioned before, most of his followers had abandoned him and left for fear that they would also be arrested and crucified. But these women had stayed faithful. They had stayed with him through that. Even though they could not stop what had happened, they witnessed it and they testified to it later. And after the Sabbath, after Passover on Sunday morning, they would go to the tomb to finish preparing Jesus' body for burial. And it is they who would discover an empty tomb, they who would be visited by angels who would hear the good news first of the resurrection. It would be Mary Magdalene who Jesus appears to first before all other disciples, and it would be they who testify to Jesus' resurrection to the other disciples. It is interesting that it is from these three that the entire story of the resurrection begins, that Jesus' life ends with them, with their witness and testimony, and his resurrection begins with their testimony as well. And I think it's a shame that the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, didn't include more about them. I would like to know more about these three women, why their faith stayed strong while so many of their male and female counterparts abandoned Jesus in his hour of need. But when we read these stories today, but that's a story for that's a sermon for another time. Why they don't get a why we don't know so much about these important figures in the resurrection story of the resurrection of Jesus. But when we read this story today, and whether we read it, the Passion narrative appears in all four Gospels. All of those Gospels, it seems very analytical the way they tell the story. There's not a lot. It's a lot of facts, and this happened, and that happened, and this happened, and that happened, and there's not a lot about how these events, how this violence, how the witness of this these horrible circumstances made the people who witnessed them feel. Luke never seems to interview, like we would do with the documentary, interview the people who were there, interview Joanna or Mary Magdalene and ask them, how did you feel when this happened? What was going through your head? We never get any of that. We're told a little bit about Jesus himself, or maybe how Pontius Pilate felt, but we never hear about the disciples who were there, who witnessed, how they feel. And for us, in sort of in modern context, it feels a little weird that this isn't addressed. But I think that the reason that their feelings are not addressed, why we are not told how they felt, is because these gospel accounts, were written a few decades after Jesus' resurrection under Roman rule. And they were written for people who lived in the Roman Empire under Roman rule. And at this time, especially if you were a conquered people, such as the Hebrews, the sight of crucifixion was very common outside of every Roman city. That Rome would crucify most criminals, especially those who did anything that made the government angry, as a sort of deterrent to other criminal acts. And so many of the first Christians probably had friends or even family members that had been crucified. The truth is the gospel authors may have not described the feelings, how it felt to watch their friend and teacher be crucified on the cross, because they didn't need to. The people who first read the gospel, these gospel accounts were written for, knew all too well those feelings. They had been in Mary and Joanna's shoes. They had seen it themselves. They had seen the horrors of someone being nailed to a cross and dying up there. And so the gospel writers didn't need to tell them how it felt, because they knew from firsthand. And while today we don't have firsthand experience with crucifixion, I hope that you have never witnessed someone actually being crucified. There are many aspects of the story that we can still connect with, that we still have personal connection with. And one thing that I want you to take away from this story, I want you to reflect on maybe on this Good Friday. One thing that maybe we can identify is the feeling that sometimes it feels like our life is not in our control, and that we are at the mercy, not necessarily of God, but of more powerful people, or people in positions of power that seem to have more sway over our lives, such as Pilate and the high priest seemed to during Jesus' trial and sentencing. In this story, for the first time in his story, Jesus is no longer the driving force in his own life. For most of the gospel account, Jesus is the one deciding things and doing things. He calls the disciples, he does the miracles, he does the preaching. Jesus is the driving force in his own life, but all of a sudden, when he is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, doesn't seem to be the driving force anymore. All of a sudden, Jesus seems to become a pawn in a power struggle between the high priest and Pilate. The high priests arrest Jesus and give him a show trial in the middle of the night, and then they bring him to Pilate for execution, because Pilate was the governor of Judea, the Roman governor of Judea, and the only person that was allowed to sentence someone to death. But then Pilate, he gets in kind of an argument with the high priest. He sends him to Herod. Herod sends him back. And Jesus doesn't really get a say in this. While they sometimes ask him stuff, it's already a foregone conclusion what will happen to Jesus. So he no longer seems to be in control of his life anymore. For most of the Passion narrative, he's lost control, it seems. And how many times have we felt that way? How many times have we felt like things in our life are just not in our control? And I don't just mean like the weather, I mean like the economy. Our business might be struggling because of dictates or tariffs or something else that's been dictated by somebody else far away from us that we don't really know and that may not care about our lives. Sometimes people make decisions that affect us tremendously, even though we don't seem to be able to to exert that kind of control. It can be frustrating, and it can be horrible to feel powerless like that. When aspects of our life are just not in our control, when we are no longer the driving force, we are no longer in the driving seat of our life, when someone else seems to be affecting it much more than we are. And when we feel powerless like this, when we feel like we are no longer in control, especially in times of fear or trouble, we may feel like God has abandoned us or is absent from our life. In the account I just read in Luke, Jesus' last words are, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." But in Matthew, he has different words, and it is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that account, I feel Jesus cries out with this feeling of powerlessness, with this feeling of abandon, like God is no longer there, asking, where is God? Where is God in all this suffering and pain that he is going through? I'm sure this feeling is familiar to many of us out there. Many who have felt powerless or felt like things are just not in our hands, that we aren't able to do anything. And maybe we have turned to the sky and asked, where is God in this? Where is God? That feeling of powerlessness, it's harmful. It hurts. It can make us question our very faith. But the story of Good Friday is not a story of God abandoning Jesus on Friday morning and then returning on Sunday morning. It is not a story of God's absence from the world for 2 or 3 days. Good Friday is a story of how even in the darkest of times, even when all seems lost and like evil has won, even when it feels like we don't have control over anything, God is still there. Maybe we can't know God's will, and maybe we don't feel his presence, especially in those times of trouble. But our faith, our experience as Christians, tell us that God is still there. God is still with us, even when we feel like crying out as Christ did, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Even as Jesus died on the cross, God was there, even if he or his disciples could not see him. This story also tells us something else, reminds us of something else. Just as Jesus' story did not end on the cross, the gospel doesn't end when he is put in the tomb, our story does not end in times of trouble. When we are in a dark place in our lives, when we feel abandoned or alone, it can feel like this is it. Nothing is ever going to get better. We are in the depths, and we're just going to live in this horrible place, this horrible feeling now. Our lives have been destroyed. The sun will never rise again. The darkness has come as it did when Jesus was on the cross, and the sun will never rise again. It can feel hopeless. It can feel like there's no point in going on. But Jesus' own story, the story of Good Friday, lets us know that that is not the case. No matter how dark the sky gets on Friday afternoon, the sun will always rise on Easter morning, and things will get better. Even when we die, we know that that is not the end. Not because we have accomplished anything or because we have been there before, but because Jesus went there before us to show us the way. And so I will say, thank you for joining me again. It is okay to feel powerless sometimes, to feel hopelessness, to cry out to God. I'm not saying that we should not feel sadness or loneliness sometimes, but to keep in our minds that even in the pits of despair, even when it seems like all hope is lost, to remember that God is still with us. God is still there. And no matter how dark the sky gets, the sun will rise again. So, thank you for joining me, and I hope I will see you on Easter morning. God bless and take care.